On the morning of June 2nd, 2018, Portland, Oregon was waking up to a typical cloudy day. The air was cool and damp, with a light mist settling over the streets. At the heart of the city stood the Oregon Culinary Institute, a school where young chefs came to chase their dreams. Normally, the building would be filled with the sound of chatter, clinking pans, and the rich aroma of breakfast being prepared. That morning, however, the halls were silent. At around 7:30 a.m., Daniel Brophy, a highly respected chef and longtime instructor, arrived early to begin his day. It was part of his routine. Daniel loved his job and took pride in being the first to arrive, making sure everything was ready before his students came in. Known for his kindness and humor, Daniel was admired by everyone who knew him. But within minutes of unlocking the doors, tragedy struck. The quiet of the school was shattered by two sudden gunshots. The first hit Daniel in the back, dropping him to the floor. The second was fired at close range, a final, fatal shot. When students arrived a short time later, expecting to see their beloved instructor bustling around as usual, they were met with a horrifying scene. Daniel was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, motionless. Panic spread as someone dialed 911. Police and paramedics rushed to the school, but it was too late. Daniel Brophy was gone. Detectives immediately began piecing together what had happened. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and nothing appeared to be stolen. Daniel's wallet, phone, and personal belongings were untouched. This wasn't a random act of violence, or it was targeted. Someone had come there specifically to kill him. Daniel was well-liked and had no known enemies. Friends and students described him as gentle, funny, and deeply dedicated to teaching. So why would anyone want to hurt him? As investigators dug deeper, they began looking at Daniel's personal life. The name that came up again and again was his wife, Nancy Brophy. Nancy was a romance novelist, best known for her self-published books filled with stories of love, passion, betrayal, and sometimes even murder. Outwardly, Nancy and Daniel seemed like the perfect couple. They had been married for nearly 3 decades, often described as supportive and deeply connected. Nancy admired Daniel's work, and Daniel encouraged her writing career. But when police looked beneath the surface, a different picture emerged. Friends revealed that the couple had been struggling financially for years. Their debts were mounting, retirement savings were gone, and they were living paycheck to paycheck. The financial strain was a constant source of stress. The investigation took a dramatic turn when detectives discovered that Daniel had a large life insurance policy, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Nancy was the sole beneficiary. This immediately gave her a clear potential motive. Police began reviewing surveillance footage from the area around the culinary school. In the hours before Daniel's death, a gray minivan, identical to the one Nancy owned, was seen driving toward the school and then leaving shortly after the time of the murder. Nancy told detectives she had been home asleep during those hours, but the footage suggested otherwise. When confronted, Nancy claimed the van in the video wasn't hers, but investigators weren't convinced. As detectives continued digging, they uncovered something chilling. Years earlier, Nancy had written a blog post titled, "How to Murder Your Husband." In it, she discussed different ways a spouse might kill their partner and get away with it. She outlined motives like money, freedom, and revenge, and talked about how to plan the perfect crime. At the time, the post was just a piece of creative writing, meant to entertain her readers. But now with Daniel dead, it felt disturbingly prophetic. The coincidence was too strange to ignore. The story quickly went public. Headlines across the nation read, "Romance novelist who wrote essay on murdering her husband charged with husband's murder." The case captured worldwide attention. Detectives then focused on the murder weapon. Ballistics showed that Daniel had been shot with a 9mm handgun. Investigators discovered that Nancy had recently purchased a Glock 9mm pistol. Even more suspiciously, she had also ordered replacement gun parts online, including a slide and barrel, components that could be swapped out to make a gun untraceable. When police searched Nancy's home, they found some of these gun parts, but the slide and barrel were missing. Prosecutors later argued that Nancy had used them to kill Daniel, then destroyed them to hide the evidence. Everything was pointing toward Nancy. The financial motive, the suspicious van, the missing gun parts, and, of course, her own words in the blog post. On September 5th, 2018, Nancy Brophy was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The arrest stunned the community. Friends of the couple were shocked, struggling to reconcile the Nancy they knew with the crime she was accused of committing. To many, Nancy and Daniel had seemed inseparable. In the weeks that followed, Nancy maintained her innocence. Through her lawyers, she claimed she loved Daniel deeply and would never hurt him. She insisted that the blog post was nothing more than fiction, a piece of writing taken completely out of context. As for the gun parts, she said they were research for a new book she was working on. The case sparked heated debate online and in the media. Some believed Nancy was guilty beyond any doubt. Others felt the case was built on circumstantial evidence and that she might have been unfairly targeted. While Nancy awaited trial, prosecutors carefully built their case. They knew they didn't have direct physical evidence like DNA or an eyewitness. Instead, they relied on a series of clues that, when combined, painted a damning picture: financial desperation, suspicious behavior, and a carefully planned crime. By early 2022, nearly 4 years after Daniel's murder, the trial was finally set to begin. The world was watching. Would the jury see Nancy as a devoted wife wrongfully accused, or as a calculating killer who turned her fiction into reality? The courtroom drama that followed would reveal shocking twists, emotional testimony, and ultimately, the answer to that haunting question. In April 2022, nearly 4 years after Daniel Brophy's murder, the trial of Nancy Brophy began in a packed Portland courtroom. The case had attracted national and international attention. Journalists filled the press section, sketch artists sharpened their pencils, and cameras waited outside the courthouse to capture every moment. Nancy, now 71, walked into court wearing a simple blouse and glasses, her hair neatly combed. She looked more like a grandmother than a killer. As she sat down beside her defense team, she remained calm and composed, occasionally glancing at the jury. For Nancy, this was more than a trial. It was her chance to convince 12 strangers that she had nothing to do with her husband's death. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Sean Overstreet, knew they faced a challenge. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no smoking gun. But what they did have was a puzzle, a series of clues that, when connected, painted a disturbing picture of greed, betrayal, and premeditation. Overstreet began his opening statement with a stark declaration. Nancy Brophy planned and executed the murder of her husband Daniel for one reason: money. He told the jury about the couple's financial struggles, emphasizing the $1.4 million in life insurance policies that Nancy stood to collect if Daniel died. He described how Nancy purchased a 9mm Glock handgun, then secretly ordered additional gun parts online, a slide and barrel, to make the weapon untraceable. He also highlighted the now infamous essay Nancy had written years earlier, How to Murder Your Husband. Overstreet acknowledged that it was a piece of fiction, but argued that it revealed Nancy's mindset and her knowledge of how to commit the perfect crime. The prosecution's narrative was clear. Nancy had motive, means, and opportunity. She knew her husband's routine, she had the weapon, and she carefully plotted every step of the murder. When it was time for the defense to speak, Lisa Maxfield, Nancy's attorney, stood and faced the jury. She painted a very different picture, one of a loving, devoted wife whose life had been shattered by tragedy. Nancy Brophy loved her husband, Maxfield said firmly. They were partners in every sense of the word. Yes, they had financial troubles, but like many couples, they faced them together. She had no reason to kill Daniel, and the state cannot prove she did. The defense argued that Nancy's writing was just that, writing, a novelist's imagination, not a confession. They insisted that the extra gun parts were simply research for one of Nancy's books, nothing more. As for the gray minivan seen near the culinary school, they claimed it was a coincidence. Plenty of similar vans drove through that area every day. The trial was set to last several weeks, and each day brought new revelations. Prosecutors began by calling Daniel's colleagues and students to the stand. They described Daniel as a kind, passionate teacher who cared deeply about his work. Several became emotional as they recounted the day they discovered his body. Next came forensic experts, who carefully walked the jury through the physical evidence. Ballistics tests confirmed that Daniel was killed with a 9mm handgun, but the exact gun could not be identified because the slide and barrel had never been recovered. This, the prosecution argued, was no accident. Nancy had disposed of them after the murder. The most dramatic moments came when prosecutors played surveillance footage showing a gray minivan near the crime scene. Jurors leaned forward as they watched the grainy video of the van driving toward the school before Daniel's death and then leaving shortly after. Investigators testified that they had compared the van's unique dents and stickers to Nancy's vehicle, concluding it was an exact match. Nancy's defense team pushed back, arguing that the video was too blurry to be definitive. They suggested it could have been any similar van passing through the area. As the trial continued, the prosecution introduced evidence about the Brophy's finances. Bank records and insurance documents revealed a grim picture. The couple was drowning in debt. They owed thousands in credit card bills, their retirement savings were depleted, and their mortgage was past due. Prosecutors argued that Nancy saw her husband's death as the only way out, a way to collect the life insurance money and rebuild her life. The defense countered by bringing up the Brophy's deep emotional bond. They showed the jury love letters and photos of the couple traveling together, laughing and holding hands. Witnesses who knew Nancy personally testified that she and Daniel were inseparable and that Nancy was utterly devastated by his death. One of the most talked about moments of the trial came when the topic of Nancy's blog post, "How to Murder Your Husband," was introduced. The defense had fought hard to keep it out of the trial, arguing that it was fictional and prejudicial, but the judge allowed it, ruling that it was relevant to Nancy's state of mind. The essay described various motives and methods for spousal murder, including using a gun and making the death look like a robbery gone wrong. Reading it aloud in court sent chills through the room. Prosecutors argued that Nancy's writing was more than coincidence. It was a window into her intentions. The defense urged the jury not to take fiction as fact, reminding them that writers often explore dark themes that have nothing to do with their real lives. As the trial reached its third week, tension in the courtroom grew. The prosecution called its final witnesses, including a gun expert who testified about the missing slide and barrel. He explained how swapping out these parts would prevent a gun from being traced to a specific shooting, a tactic often used by experienced criminals. The defense cross-examined aggressively, suggesting that there was no proof Nancy had ever used the gun to kill Daniel. Without the actual weapon, they argued, the state's case was built on speculation. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Nancy Brophy took the stand in her own defense. Speaking softly, Nancy described her life with Daniel, their shared dreams and their struggles. She admitted they had financial problems, but said they faced them as a team. When asked about the morning of the murder, Nancy claimed she had been home asleep. She denied driving her van near the culinary school and insisted that the surveillance footage must have shown someone else's vehicle. Regarding the blog post, Nancy told the jury it was written years earlier as part of a writer's workshop. "It was just an exercise," she said, her voice breaking. "I never imagined anyone would take it seriously." As for the extra gun parts, she said they were for research. "Writers need to understand details," she explained. "I ordered them so I could accurately describe them in a book." That's all. Her testimony was emotional and at times tearful. She maintained her innocence, portraying herself as a grieving widow falsely accused. When cross-examined by the prosecution, however, Nancy struggled to answer certain questions. Why had she bought a second set of gun parts shortly before Daniel's death? Why had she deleted certain emails related to the purchase? Why had she not come forward with a solid alibi immediately? Her responses were vague, and prosecutors seized on every inconsistency. After weeks of testimony, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution reminded jurors of the timeline, the financial motive, and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence. "This was a carefully planned murder," Overstreet said. "Nancy Brophy wrote the story, and then she lived it." The defense urged the jury to remember the lack of direct proof. "Suspicion is not enough," Maxfield argued. "The state has no weapon, no eyewitness, no definitive evidence tying Nancy to this crime." As the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom fell silent. Nancy sat at the defense table, clutching a tissue, while reporters rushed outside to broadcast updates. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury reached a decision. The tension was palpable as everyone filed back into the courtroom. The judge asked for the verdict to be read. Nancy Brophy, on the charge of second-degree murder, We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Gas filled the room. Nancy sat perfectly still, her face blank, as the reality of the verdict sank in. The once beloved romance writer, who had built a career on tales of love and happily ever afters, was now facing the rest of her life behind bars. The courtroom was tense as the final chapter of the Nancy Brophy case began. After the jury delivered their guilty verdict on the charge of second-degree murder, all attention turned to the sentencing phase. Nancy Brophy, once a celebrated romance novelist, now faced the consequences of a crime that had shocked Portland and captivated the nation. Daniel Brophy's friends, students, and family gathered in the courtroom. Many were emotional, holding back tears, as prosecutors recounted the events that led to his death. The crime had been swift, deliberate, and entirely preventable. Daniel had trusted his wife, his partner of nearly 3 decades, and she had betrayed him in the most extreme way imaginable. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime. They described Nancy's purchase of a 9mm Glock handgun, the acquisition of replacement gun parts, and the calculated timing of her attack. Financial motive was at the center of their argument. The life insurance policies she stood to gain painted a stark picture of greed and planning. Victim impact statements were the most emotional part of the day. Former students described Daniel as a mentor and friend, someone who inspired them and shaped their careers. One student recounted the shock of walking into the culinary school every day, knowing that Daniel would never again stand at the front of the classroom, sharing his knowledge and passion for cooking. Daniel's family spoke with heavy hearts, recalling his kindness, humor, and the joy he brought to everyone around him. They described how their lives had been shattered by his death and pleaded with the judge to impose the maximum sentence. When Nancy took the stand to speak before sentencing, she maintained her innocence. She claimed she loved Daniel deeply and would never have harmed him. Regarding the blog post, How to Murder Your Husband, she said it had been purely a creative exercise, part of her work as a writer. The missing gun parts, she insisted, had nothing to do with the murder and were intended for research for a future novel. Her statements were met with skepticism. Prosecutors countered, pointing to the combination of motive, opportunity, and behavior surrounding the murder. They argued that Nancy had not only thought about killing her husband, but had carefully executed the plan to ensure no evidence would link her to the crime. After reviewing all evidence, hearing witnesses, and considering the arguments of both sides, the judge delivered the sentence. Nancy Brophy was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The courtroom reaction was mixed. Daniel's family and friends felt a sense of closure and justice, though the loss of their loved one could never be undone. For Nancy, the sentence marked the beginning of decades behind bars, a dramatic fall from the life of a celebrated novelist to a convicted murderer. Outside the courtroom, media outlets reported extensively on the case. Headlines highlighted the chilling connection between Nancy's fiction and her real-life actions. True crime podcasts and documentaries picked up the story, analyzing every detail, from the blog post to the missing gun parts. The case fascinated the public because it blurred the line between fiction and reality, showing how a person could turn their imagination into a horrifying act. In prison, Nancy reportedly kept to herself, spending hours reading and writing. Fellow inmates and guards noted her quiet demeanor, but the story of her crime continued to follow her. People debated whether she had been a masterful planner or a grieving widow wrongfully convicted. The lack of direct physical evidence meant that discussions about her guilt or innocence would continue for years, though the jury had already made its decision. The legacy of the case extended beyond Nancy's imprisonment. Daniel Brophy's memory was honored through memorials and tributes at the Oregon Culinary Institute. Former students cooked dishes in his name, sharing stories of his mentorship and kindness. The institute remained a place of learning and inspiration, even as it carried the memory of the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. Psychologists and true crime experts analyzed the case, highlighting the unique blend of motive, opportunity, and psychological manipulation. Nancy's ability to create compelling fiction, combined with financial desperation, painted a portrait of someone whose imagination may have crossed into reality. The blog post, while fictional, became a symbol of the case, a haunting reminder of how words can sometimes mirror life in unexpected and tragic ways. Public fascination with the case continued long after the trial. The combination of romance, betrayal, and murder created a narrative that was compelling, shocking, and impossible to ignore. It became a case study in how ordinary-seeming lives could hide extraordinary darkness. For Daniel's loved ones, the impact of the crime remained deeply personal. While justice had been served, nothing could erase the pain of losing him so violently. His legacy, however, lived on through the students he taught, the colleagues he inspired, and the friends who remembered him as a man of warmth, humor, and unwavering kindness. Nancy Brophy's story also served as a cautionary tale. It illustrated the dangers of obsession, the potential consequences of financial desperation, and the blurred lines between fiction and reality. For writers and readers alike, it was a reminder that sometimes imagination can intersect with life in dangerous ways. Even years later, the case remained a reference point in discussions about true crime, criminal psychology, and domestic murders. The details of the crime, the weapon, the blog post, the financial motive, and the careful planning became central to understanding how domestic murders can unfold, even in households that appear ordinary and loving. As Nancy began serving her life sentence, public interest in the story did not wane. Documentaries, books, and online discussions continued to explore the crime, the investigation, and the trial. The fascination stemmed not only from the murder itself, but from the eerie parallels between Nancy's writing and her actions. People wondered how a creative mind could plot fiction and then live it in reality. For those studying criminal behavior, Nancy Brophy's case became a study in motive, premeditation, and the complexities of human relationships. It highlighted how financial strain, hidden resentments, and access to lethal means could converge in a moment of tragedy. The story of Nancy and Daniel Brophy remains a haunting example of domestic crime, blending elements of love, betrayal, and greed. It shows how trust can be shattered, how appearances can be deceiving, and how consequences of one fateful decision can ripple across the lives of everyone involved. In the end, the Brophy case left a lasting impact. Daniel's life, though tragically cut short, was remembered for his warmth, generosity, and passion for teaching. Nancy's actions, whether driven by desperation or calculation, became a stark warning of how quickly life can turn dark. The case continues to capture the attention of true crime enthusiasts, writers, and psychologists, serving as a chilling reminder that sometimes truth is stranger and darker than fiction. As we close this story, remember the lives touched and the lessons learned. If you found this account compelling, please like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories, where we uncover the mysteries behind